All right. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. Last time I was here was, I think, 5 years ago. And I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of go over a number of projects that I worked on in social computing over the past few years. Some of it is leading edge on the last part of the talk, but a lot of it is kind of more historical as well. Um, so I guess it's kind of common knowledge now, and a little bit of a cliche, but like really social technologies are here and really are part of our everyday lives. From the way we communicate with our friends and colleagues, to the way we gather knowledge, to even the way we politically organize. Technologies that are social computing technologies, enable and facilitate a lot of these things. And so that's kind of the focus of my research for the past few years, is really to study and design and deploy new technologies that help people connect and collaborate. And so I emphasize the word deploy because that's something that I've been putting a lot of emphasis in my work, where I try to not just build something for writing a publication, but also to put it out in the world, have people use it, and kind of learning from how people use it and iterate on that. So I worked in a variety of different settings, from helping children learn programming, like Michael mentioned, to helping people in the workplace delegate tasks, to conversational assistance. So I'll go over a few projects in 4 different categories. I'll end more on like the more recent work that we've been doing at Snap. So I'll start with the work that I was doing with Scratch, and maybe I can tell you a little bit more of a personal story of why I got involved in this. So I moved to Boston in about 2001 after college. I went to college in Mexico, where I'm from, and then I joined a tech company in Boston as a software developer. So I was there for about 4 years, and on my year 3, I started to get itchy and trying to understand, trying to do things beyond just what I was doing as a software engineer. And one of the areas that I was really interested in exploring is kind of how do we enable other people, like myself, who I think for me at least, learning to program really opened a lot of doors. Even coming to the US was one of those. And how do we make that more available for everyone? And so as I looked around in the world, like trying to see who is working in that space, I found a team at MIT who was actually working on building tools to help people, help children in particular, learn programming. And so that's kind of how I got interested in this field. And for me, kind of the aspect of this space that I found particularly interesting is kind of how to take that experience of programming beyond just like you and your computer, you and your IDE, and make it into a more social, a more collaborative type of activity. And as a software engineer that I was, I realized that in the real world, it was very different from how I was trained to learn to program, where I was kind of basically by myself. In the real world, as you probably know, you go to Stack Overflow, you Google this, take snippets of code from here or there, and that's kind of what I wanted to bring to the way people learn programming when they're young. And so, as I said, I found the Scratch team, who was just starting with this project, was very early in the stages of the project. And what we were doing is essentially build this tool that was very easy to use for anyone. I don't know how many of you have used Scratch. Many of you, so I don't have to explain a lot about what this does. So just kind of the core ideas of Scratch is that we wanted to make programming much easier by simply representing all the computational constructs in blocks that you can stick together, so you wouldn't make syntax mistakes very easily. And it was very much focused on allowing people to bring their own media. Like in this case, there was a kid who drew this cool spaceship, bringing that media into the environment that you can then program and manipulate. So at the time, Scratch was just a desktop application, and that's what I kind of found both frustrating and also an opportunity to explore deeper into how to make that beyond just you and your desktop. So yeah, that's actually a video I found recently about Scratch early on. You can see it's like Windows Vista, I think, the frame. It's really old. But the idea is very, very simple. You just drag and drop these blocks and control something on the screen. And so what I did, this was around 2005, when Flickr and I think YouTube just started, but Flickr in particular was a big inspiration for me, where if you're a photographer, you can go to Flickr, find a large community of photographers, get comments on your photos, improve on your practice, learn from other people's work. And actually, Flickr in particular allows you to download photos and remix them because they're all, not all, but a lot of them are in Creative Commons license. So that's kind of what I wanted to do, but for programming. And the idea was that if you make a cool project, it shouldn't stay just on your laptop for you to show to your friends. but it should be something that you can put out in the world, just like you do on YouTube or Flickr, and then people can interact with it, and you have an audience for your creations. So today, the community, I just checked a few days ago, has grown to about 46 million people. It has about 44 million projects that people have created from all over the world. One of the features that we added early on was this idea of groups, very much like what today is Facebook groups, where people can come together on a particular theme, work on things together. And one of the key pieces of what we saw as a very big potential for this community to help people learn is to support remixing. And sure enough, about 25% of all the projects are remixes of other people's projects. Let me give you an example of what a remix is. So here is a game that a girl made, very simple, very modest. It was like this jumping monkey that you can move with your keyboard. But what I saw is like this whole evolution of how that little simple project turned into many iterations and many other kinds of collaborations. And that's just one example. So for example, in this case, she posted this project. Then a few days later, this other kid took that project and then added what they call pink sleeper. So this was just like some shoes to the monkey so that the monkey could detect when it's touching the black lines, which is the platform, or the red area, which is like the lava that you're supposed to avoid. And so with that technique, this person just changed it and made it slightly better, much more easy to control and to count score. And then a few days later, this other kid said, I made this by adapting the shoe technique from the previous project, and then they created a whole different world with like lava that comes vertically, and it was a lot more complicated with multiple levels and so on. Subsequently, this other kid took that, and you can see in one of the comments there it says, hey, Wiz, which is the creator of the previous project, I love this game. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind me making some changes. And you can see the green project is what they made out of that. It was like a much more sophisticated, like the graphics are really cool, again, multiple levels. And not only that, but every single one of those dots represents another remix of that green project. So overall, it created this whole kind of mini community around this one project. And like that, there is like millions of others. One of the other pieces that was really interesting is that these two kids, that the green project and the orange one, started to create a group, and they call it a company, where they wanted to create games together. In many of these cases, they assign each other roles, like somebody may be the artist, somebody may be the programmer, the sound artist, etc. And they created this kind of collaborative space for them to build games, and they made a bunch of games. And so that's kind of the norm in the community. There is many, many collaborations happening across geographies. One of the things that I didn't show you is that in Scratch, you can create a project, say, in English. Somebody can download it and see the code in Hebrew or Spanish or Chinese. And so it allows you to see the code in the language that you're using, which is pretty unique for programming languages. So the other piece that I was really interested in doing is making the Scratch community into a laboratory that you can use for exploring all sorts of social computing questions. So as Michael mentioned, we study a lot of how children in particular perceive intellectual property. And so we often think of children copying content from others, but in this case, they were the ones being copied or remixed. And so we study things like, how people want to receive attribution when they're being remixed, whether it's automatic or is manual, and the ways these are represented and interpreted by people in different ways, and all sorts of different studies that kind of investigated the nature of collaboration in this particular community that can speak to collaboration more broadly. And the last thing we did for this particular project is that we put together a data set of 5 years of activity on Scratch, the first 5 years, and published it online. Nature has a really cool journal that you can just publish data. And so that's what we did, a data descriptor. And so since then, many researchers around the world have used it to study anything from how children learn programming to economists looking at how cooperation and collaboration happens online. And so if there is one thing that you can take from this project is that this data set, if you're interested in analyzing data or using data, this could be a good source of resources for you to explore. And so I went from trying to understand how we can connect people and enable them to collaborate for learning new skills. And then I moved to a new space as I was, I moved away from Media Lab, and I was looking for a new area to explore. I had been working on Scratch for 6 years. Luckily, I was at MSR, where you're given the freedom to do kind of whatever you want. And so two things happened around that time. It was around 2011. The first thing that happened is that I saw a shift in the way the technologies that we were building, things like the Scratch community, Wikipedia, YouTube, and so on, they move away from what I saw primarily kind of creative expression tools. So, if you think about YouTube, the original ways people were using YouTube or Flickr were really to express yourself creatively and to put things out there for people to see. But I think what I saw around this time in 2011 was a shift towards the use of these technologies to facilitate collective action and societal impact of this. This is around the time that the Arab Spring happened, right? And so, you can argue how much, Twitter and Facebook had a role in the Arab Spring, but they had a role. And so these kind of really resonated with me to see like how these things that, I was, playing with cute cats and, moving them on the screen to like, organizing revolutions, all these part of the same types of technologies. So that's the first thing. The second thing that happened is that, as I mentioned, I grew up in Mexico, where around this time the violence in Mexico due to the drug war was increasing significantly. And the only way for me to know what was going on was through social technologies, through Twitter, Facebook, and so on, because traditional media was censored by the drug cartels. And so I found this space as a really interesting space to explore and to really question and trying to answer this question of, how can we help people connect and collaborate to learn about the world around them, to learn about the local events. So if you're in Egypt, it may be a revolution. If you're in Mexico, it may be about how to avoid being killed by the cartels. But really, how do we bring people together with this goal of learning about the world? And so, as I said, the context in which I started to explore this was less about building and more about studying and seeing, let's see what people already do, and then we can decide what to build. And so one of the first things that I started to look at is how information traveled through these social media ecosystems in a place like Mexico, where, as I'll read out from this article from the Washington Post, fearing for their lives and the safety of their families, journalists are adhering to a near complete news blackout under strict orders of drug smuggling organizations who dictate via daily telephone calls, emails, and news releases what can or cannot be printed or aired. And this kind of news blackout also extended to the government, where the article continues and says how the government officials in the city of Nuevo Laredo, which is in the border with Texas, in that city, the mayor mysteriously disappears for days and refuses to discuss drug violence. And even the military who presides over the soldiers doesn't hold any news conferences. So imagine you're in that position and you see horrible things happening around you, from car bombs to grenade attacks and shootings, and there is really nothing in the traditional news media. So what you see, and what I started seeing remotely, was friends and family who live there telling me, oh, look at this message on Twitter. Like there is this report of a shooting or this report of this violent event, sometimes with photos, sometimes just text. And a lot of them, and I'll translate this to English. So this is an example of a tweet that I found where just this anonymous woman, Angela, she posted like by this supermarket, there was some risky situation, and that's the kind of term people use to refer to all these violent events. And so we start seeing a lot of these kind of organically organized neighbors, local communities reporting what's going on. In the same way you see people here using something like Waze to avoid traffic, there you will use Twitter and the particular hashtags to avoid being killed by one of these shootings that are happening. And so what I did is we had a partnership with Twitter at the time, and so we gathered data from 4 different cities that were particularly affected by the violence in Mexico for 18 months. We gathered about 600,000 messages on Twitter and trying to understand what are the dynamics of what people are doing there. And so one thing that we did is, this is an example of one city in particular, this diagram, where on the y-axis you see the number of followers that people have. Each dot represents a person. On the x-axis, you see the number of tweets or messages that they posted on a particular city's set of hashtags. And so among the many things that we found is like this emergence of these particular individuals that post significant amount of content on these communities and also have a lot of followers, in essence playing the role of what traditional media will do. And if you look at what they were doing, they were essentially reading and collating through hundreds and hundreds of tweets. I interviewed a number of them. They spend like 10 hours a day sitting on their computers, analyzing and browsing through this information and posting it back to the community. And the community will find that really valuable and sometimes retweet, sometimes ask a question like, oh, which supermarket do you mean? That sort of thing. And so I found that really, really interesting. And one of the other things we did was analyzing as well as the retweet network in terms of who is the person, who are the people most retweeted. And sure enough, the same group of people were also coming up as some of the most widely spread people in this community. So, we did a number of studies there, from like trying to understand how language evolved and how people may express, how they may lose sensitivity to the violence through the messages on Twitter. But it was very much focused on like understanding what people do. And so what we wanted to really do is like, how do we build systems that may help or may be inspired by these type of activities, perhaps not in a very dangerous place like Mexico, because I didn't want to experiment in a place like that, but maybe in a more safe space like where we are in Seattle, for example. And so we built a number of systems, experimental systems, that help us curate hyperlocal information. And by hyperlocal information, I mean things around neighborhoods, or things around even like a few blocks in a city. So one of the things we built was a system that essentially grabs Twitter information, Twitter messages, to create neighborhood news reports. So we deploy this as an application in Seattle in particular, where you can kind of see what was going on in your neighborhood, even before Twitter had these kind of city-specific trending topics. Then we also explore ways of nudging contributions. So we often saw that something was happening. Maybe one person posted something on Twitter, but there was not a lot of information beyond that. And we wanted to know, where exactly is this happening? So we built a system that kind of nudged people as they were tweeting, and maybe nudge other people who were self-reporting being at that location to gather more information. And then one other things that we did is that we also started to look at ways to not just rely on which people are already there, but also sending people to locations to help us gather information, which I'll go into more detail in a second. One other thing that we did, actually, with a student here at Stanford, we worked on ways of summarizing Twitter feeds from particular events. This was during the World Cup, so we used kind of World Cup games in the form of comics. So like, how do we, with a 4-panel comic, can summarize what happened in a game, for example? And one other thing we did was also a application that kind of connects commuters with one another as they travel, to tell stories and share poems and stuff like that. That one actually was published as an Android app that was somewhat popular during these few years. But I'll go into more details on this event reporting with offline crowds, because I think it provides a slightly different angle from the way typically crowdsourcing is done, which is typically more focused on like somebody like mTurkers or crowd workers on a screen. And in this case, we wanted to send people out in the streets to collect information. So I'll show you a video that describes the system. So the user experience on the requester side was very simple. We tried to make it like what is that called? This is those books where you complete just sentences. Basically, just say something like, I would like to use Eventful to cover the event blah that will take place at this time on this location, and then they will select the kind of event it will be. And based on the kind of event that they selected, we created a number of tasks that we will post on a marketplace. In this case in particular, it was TaskRabbit, where we will say, hey, if you show up at this location at this time to take a photo, we'll give you $10, $20, whatever. The idea was that we could put together an event report in under an hour and under $100, and kind of very quickly create this kind of crowdsourced event reporting type of activity. We deploy this in many different, 11 different events across the US, including a conference called South by Southwest in Austin. And we partnered with a number of local bloggers who wanted to cover certain local events that, as we know, local newspapers are kind of disappearing. So they wanted to, in some ways delegate to the system the gathering of information. One of the interesting tidbits that we learned from interacting with the bloggers is that they felt that the reports that our system was creating were kind of too neutral in some ways, which was kind of surprising to us. And part of it was that a lot of these local bloggers or local reporters tended to have an angle that they wanted to always pose, introduce into their stories. Like maybe there is some construction that is happening and they wanted to complain about that, or some problem that the neighborhood was having. So they use our reports, they massage them, they kind of change them a little bit, and then they post them into their local blogs and kind of mini newspapers that they had. So that was kind of a genre of work where we tried to kind of bring people together, both crowd workers, requesters, neighbors, and also trying to understand how people connect and collaborate out there in the wild to report on what's happening in their local events and in their local communities. And so, going from like something as different from like children learning programming to reporting local events, they're all part of this kind of fabric of technologies that basically bring people together and help us achieve something bigger than what we can do individually. So as I mentioned, at the time I was at Microsoft, so we built a lot of these systems, deployed them out into the world. But I always felt that in any organization where you are, there are certain constraints and certain kinds of projects that may thrive and other kinds that may not thrive just by virtue of the environment where you are. And I found that at Microsoft, and I don't know why it took me so long, that really the projects that will thrive are those that are focused on productivity. Microsoft is a sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. Just about the
Yeah,
last project.
Yeah.
Um, could you talk about some of the limitations of that approach and what worked well? You kind of covered that, but what didn't work well?
Yeah, I think the main challenge is cost. So for like crowdsourcing news reporting and sending people out into the world is cost. And as I said, we tried to make it under $100, but it was more expensive than that.
But I'm also wondering about the quality of the reporting and what kinds of stories, Like I imagine that this wouldn't work well for certain kinds of stories.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so we were not under the impression that we were going to do like investigative journalism or any kind of like deep reporting. It was really more like listicle type of article, like something that you will see on BuzzFeed, like the 5 things you missed at the parade, or so that sort of thing. And we were very clear when we interacted with some of the bloggers and so on to make sure that they didn't expect like this super in-depth thing. It was more like a list of facts. This happened. Here's a photo of this particular thing. And so that was something that I will say is a limitation. But we knew that coming into that. Yeah. I think those were probably some of the main ones. And as I mentioned, like the neutrality, in some ways we saw it as a positive thing, but in some ways the users that were using our system felt that, oh, well, I wish you had like the angle, like they probably expected to like copy and paste the article that we produced into their blog. The reality is that they had to massage it. And that's probably a limitation as well. Yeah.
Do you imagine that this could be really used for news reporting?
I do, yeah. That was the original idea. We had this grand vision, like, oh yeah, we'll put that out there. We actually talked to folks who are in like newsrooms and so on, and they were like, yeah, I could imagine do something like this. I think, yeah, that was just we didn't push hard enough, probably. I mean, I think if we had continued working in that space, it could have happened. And you see, like CNN, for example, had this app called CNN iReporter, which I think happened around the same time. But like I see here and there, like more and more interest in doing this sort of thing. I think the incentives are a key challenge. One thing that I didn't mention, in some of the events, we rely both on nudging people on social media that were at the event, and we're like, oh, you're there. Do you mind taking a photo of this or that? As well as on these paid workers. And we combine both streams of information. And one of the challenges that we saw sometimes were, one, that the people who were there at the event felt maybe like if they knew that we were paying somebody else, felt like, oh, this person is paying. Why am I not getting paid? Like, why are you taking advantage of my time? And so that was something that we didn't realize how it was going to be problematic. The other one is like some of the events that we covered were kind of small and local in nature. So having some stranger, imagine a task rabbit, well, maybe this will be a fine place. But like some events, maybe like, who is this person and why are they here? And they will often present themselves as like, oh, I'm working for this startup that is doing local event reporting and so on. But that was an awkward thing that I don't think we figured out how to solve. But I think cost probably was the main limitation in the end. Yeah.
The system categorize the reports in positive, negative reports, and things like that.
What do you mean by positive and negative?
If there is a bunch of reports collected, and how do you take care of the data? It can be massive data.
Oh, yeah. So I didn't mention we had a curator online that we hired from Upwork, who was a writer, who essentially had an interface where they could accept or reject, or reject with changes, like say, oh, this photo is blurry, can you take another one? Or, hey, this seems, invalid information or something. It was mainly just on a feed. They will accept or reject. We had really no way to know if something was factually true or not. In fact, one of the experiments we did was like a report on, I think it was like the snow. There were a bunch of snow storms across the U.S. And we saw that some of the people we hired, they didn't actually go out in the streets. They went online, searched for like photos of snow or something, and then they like uploaded it to our system. So that was a challenge that we observed too. Like people could, I guess, cheat in some ways, but there's better ways to figure those things out. Yeah, we didn't have. I mean, we did have like a mechanism to curate content.
On the event, for example, if I am at
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, we didn't have any. Yeah. No, like, oh, this.
wow, I'm at a funny conference. I don't know.
Right.
Right now.
Yeah, we didn't try to do any qualitative, just facts. Yes, yeah. And so all the structure of the missions that we show workers were very much about like collecting factual information, and the kinds of questions we asked them and tasks were based on the type of event that they were at. Yeah. So the last project that I wanted to talk about, like, in terms of the big deployments, is this project that we worked on a few years ago, where we wanted to figure out how to make more efficient the connection that happens between people by allowing them to delegate. And one thing that you probably saw from the previous project, one of the key things that at least was inspiring to me was this idea that you can delegate to a system a complex task and let the system do its thing. And so we went around and asked a bunch of office workers in many different companies. We did a survey, we also did interviews, where we asked them, like, if they had an assistant, what would they want the assistant to help them with? So that's kind of how we, started to think about this idea in the space of, office workers. And, scheduling meetings came up at the top. And so part of our idea, which we were kind of naive at the time, we're like, oh, we'll solve scheduling meetings first, then we'll go down and, solve all the other ones. It took us 3 years to do meetings, and it's now a product that Office offers. But, I left Microsoft after that. So it's really a big problem. The main challenge that we wanted to solve is something like this. You probably have experienced something like this. So you get an email and you're like, oh, cool, email notification. Then you open it and it's like somebody wants to meet with you. In this case, one of our interns is like, hey, I met at this conference. Do you want to chat about potential internships? So I was like, sure. So then I go to my calendar, to switch apps, to go to my calendar, check potential time, and then send them an email and say, oh yeah, sure, at this time I might be available. And then they may reply, oh, sorry, I'm not available at that time. What about this other time? And then I go back to my calendar and like, oh yeah. So then I add something in the calendar, send the invitation, and done. That's kind of the easy path, right? We've seen all these things go back and forth for days, and that's not ideal. So part of our goal was to, make in situ delegation possible. And by in situ delegation, I mean the idea that you can delegate to an assistant within the application that you're already using. In this case, email. And so what we wanted to do is being able to simply CC the assistant, in this case, Cortana, in an email thread, and then forget about it and let the assistant take over all the back and forth and the analyzing the different kinds of times and so on. And so from the user perspective, let's say I am the one who has access to this assistant. I send an email to this other person, and I CC the assistant to help us find the time. Then without me involved, the assistant will send an email offering times based on my calendar, because the assistant has access to my calendar, with natural language. No, we want to avoid like any kind of buttons or anything that looked not like a regular conversation that people will have with a human. And then the person will reply again in natural language, like, yeah, I'm free on Monday. And so you saw that the assistant, for example, offered a few times in different days. The person roughly didn't have to say what time on Monday because there was only one time on Monday. And then the assistant at the end will send the calendar invitation to everyone, add it to the calendar automatically, and so on. That was kind of like the magic that we were going after. And we also knew that the in-person meetings tend to be very complex. Like sometimes it's not just two people; it can be many people. It could be people inside the same company, outside the company, etc. And so that's kind of the problem that we were trying to solve. And so our goal was to build this scheduling assistant that helped people, find the time to meet. But there's a long history of AI trying to solve this, and many of us have failed. So why did we think we were going to be able to do it? The other one is the language understanding is also very difficult, as we all know. And one of the things that we thought about is like we were trying to figure out why is it that a lot of these systems have tried and failed. One of them is that there is very low tolerance for error. So as soon as the system fails, you're like, this doesn't work, you move on. You can see this with Alexa or Siri. You try once and then you move on if it doesn't work. The other one is that, it's a cold start problem. Like you don't have enough data about like meeting, scheduling, conversations. How are you gonna solve that? And how are you gonna collect this data? And the last one is that, scheduling, as I said, is really hard. It also gets at the cultural styles of different organizations and people. There may be people who are like, I don't want to meet in the mornings and so on. So that getting all that right was really difficult. So what we did is that we created a kind of Wizard of Oz type of approach, but to build a real life system. And so we had a three-tier infrastructure architecture for this. So we started with automation, where we tried to simply use off-the-shelf NLP tools to try to kind of parse out things like dates and things like locations and stuff like that. But we knew that was going to fail, as we've seen many, many years. So what we had is a tier 2 of escalation. So if the automatic part detected that it was not confident with the results, then it will escalate to non-expert crowd workers who could have these micro tasks that are very well targeted towards extracting a particular kind of information, and then they will kind of solve that particular problem, and that data will then feed back into the NLP system to become better over time. But that was not enough, because we saw that even these two systems, these two pieces, had limitations. Like it was limited by the kinds of workflows that we were going to design. And so what we did is that we engaged with a third tier of macro tasks, as we call them. These are expert workers, typically administrative assistants, who will take over the whole process if something in micro didn't get resolved as we expected. And so this escalation happened from micro to macro, and the data of the escalation was something that fed into the system to kind of improve the workflows over time. And so that's kind of how we started. I won't go into a lot of detail about the kind of automation part, but we use a classifier that essentially allows us to see the different responses that people had to what we call a ballot, which is the offering that the assistant sends. And then it will determine whether the response of the individual match any of the options in the ballot. And it was pretty accurate, but obviously this has flaws. So that's why we had the microtask, where essentially it was a very simple web interface that we show to workers, where we ask them, like, when is this meeting supposed to happen? And then they could have like a little range of times when they could enter that. Or maybe even things like, is this even a meeting? Like, we are not able to detect if this is really about a meeting. And so the goal of this task is that they were completed in about 10 to 30 seconds, so very quick and short. And they were designed to collect data for automation. Then the macro tasks that I mentioned were triggered by the red button there. When the worker says, I don't know how to answer this, the options that you're giving me are not enough, then it will escalate to a macro worker, which had a much more in-depth view of the whole kind of conversation that has been going on maybe for hours, days, between the different people. And then it will start to intervene and take over. And we were collecting all this data to influence the design of new paths in our workflow. So our workflow was evolving over time, like many expert systems. And the idea was to combine, this kind of expert system approach of workflows with these microtasks, with macro tasks, and as well as the more automatic part. And so I guess one of the key things for us is that we wanted the system to work well from day one. And this allowed us to do that, because on day 0, you could imagine being 100% macro. On day 10, it may be like 5% micro and so on. And over time, more and more things move from macro to micro and from micro to automation. Last time I checked, I'm not in the project anymore, but like the project continues, as I mentioned, as a product from Office. It's called calendar.help. You can sign up there. It's about 75% of the micro tasks are now automated. And some of those continue to they continue to improve that as well. One of the things that I did last night, I wanted to see how people are reacting to the product because I don't have access to the data anymore, and so I see tons of people, using the system. Some people, saying that they've been using it for a while, or things like, it works great for saving times, but it doesn't speak my language, which is another one of the big main challenges that we had. Microsoft has offices all over. Yes.
Assistant to talk in natural language rather than just giving buttons?
Because the buttons will eventually be constrained by the workflows that you as a designer will come up with. And so there's always these exceptions. And so people will like, oh, Monday I could do, but I'm picking up my kids and maybe I would prefer Tuesday. So a lot of that nuance will be lost if you have buttons. And the other thing is that in general, so from some of the experiments we did, uh, buttons tend, like emails that look like a form, people tend to ignore them and think of it as spam. And that was more practical, but not really just like a research problem. But it's really like we saw that when we introduced those things, the adoption rates were like significantly lower. But really, the main idea was like all the nuance aspects. So, for example, we started with all of the recruiters at Microsoft were using this to schedule meetings with people they wanted to meet, and we kind of figured out the recruiting scenario really well. But then we started to connect with companies outside Microsoft, like salespeople, and they were having a completely different kind of set of constraints and requirements. And so all of that made us realize, like, really the way to start and build a product that can be used today is by having this like flexible architecture. The forms will be too constraining for all these different solutions. Yeah. One thing that I have to say is that one of the things that we worry, and I was talking to Michael about this a few hours ago, about how people understood the system from their perspective. We were trying to be very clear that the system had humans in the loop, and that it's partly automated, partly not, and so on. But most people don't read all these details. And I noticed from this tweet yesterday that some people are like, I don't know if this is the one I saw. I love it. Yeah, I saw one tweet somewhere where people are like, "Oh, this AI system is like Skynet or whatever. It's like so magical it works." And we wrote even like a Harvard Business Review, like a more popular press article about this, in addition to our Kai paper, trying to tell people how it works, because we wanted to make sure that people understand. And even when they sign up, that there's a clear thing like, "Oh, this is just as humans in the loop." But that's something that I still worry to this day. I mean, I'm no longer involved in the project, but I still see as a limitation, and I kind of wanted to close on that with the limitations of. The privacy implications for this. Obviously, if you're a doctor, you probably shouldn't be using this, and how to signal that in the best way. The other one is the cost of the humans in the loop. That's obviously a cost that we had, but over time, that's reduced as you automate more of the things. But also the cost in terms of like the labor cost. And one of the people at MSR, who I don't know if you know, Mary Gray, has been writing a lot about like the ethics of using crowd work and what we should do about these things. And luckily, at the time that we were working on this project, we worked within the constraints of the vendors that Microsoft approved us to use, which all of them kind of make sure that their employees have like vacation and they have like good paying salaries and so on, which made our system more expensive, but also perhaps more ethical. But that's always something that I was kind of worried about and continue to be worried about. The other one, and just more in terms of the user experience, there were two key limitations. One is about the friction for invitees. So sure, I'm now delegating to the assistant, but now this other person has to deal with the assistant back and forth. Like that feels in some ways unfair. And so the goal was that over time, if everyone is on the system, then the assistant could like just look at people's calendar and do it. But that's definitely a concern. And also one of the reasons why some people didn't want to use this, because if you're a salesperson, for example, and you want to like impress your customer, you don't want to like say, oh, my assistant will take care of the meeting. You want them to feel like they have all your attention. And the other one is just like, as much as we try the system to be flexible, meetings are very complex. And there were definitely, like, when it comes to like multiple people's involved in a meeting, at some point it's just impossible. Like imagine trying to organize a 20-person meeting. It's like really, really difficult. And so we had to like set limits on like, okay, we're gonna reject those kind of requests. But part of our goal was to really think about like the productivity space and how scheduling was one piece in this whole universe of the kinds of things that you could delegate through an architecture like this one. and kind of that's kind of the premise that where we started this project, and where I think this could be a future way in which this can deploy. So I have a few minutes only, but I'll kind of talk about a little bit about the new directions that we are exploring in our lab. Yes.
You decided to call humans when the model was like low on confidence, but a case could be there when model is like doing bad, but still it's highly confident. How do you deal that?
We had a percentage of tasks always go to humans just to like evaluate the potential issues like that, but that definitely was a problem too. We did. I mean, in some ways we were overcautious, and at the beginning we sent everything to humans, and we paid extra just for that. But we felt like we wanted to have a system that worked well, and so yeah, that's definitely a challenge. But surprisingly, I didn't see that as a big problem. Most of the things that we detected as failures were actually failures, and vice versa. So, yeah. Somebody else? Yeah.
No, so you mentioned you evaluated with accuracy. Did you also use like other balance metrics like sensitivity, specificity to like get true positive and false?
Yes.
And what did you find?
Well, what we did is we primarily focused on qualitative assessments of, like, we went over conversations, full conversations, and tried to figure out, is this an experience that we wish we could have? And then from there, like, if the answer was no, then we went and see where it failed. And it could have failed in, the automatic part, or it could have failed more in the, like, oh, our workflow sucks in this particular scenario, or even in, like, the copy of the messages. Like, we hired writers to come up with copy that was friendly and also very direct. And we had a project that we never deployed where we tried to match the person's style. So if somebody was very direct and short, the assistant also tried to be very direct and short, and vice versa. If somebody was more verbose, we will try to match that. So we really more focus on like the qualitative experience for users and trying to like reverse engineer that based on what we saw in the system happening. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so Wizard of Oz at a scale, basically. And yeah, surprisingly, it worked well as a product that now people can use. But again, it's expensive. So yeah, so I have only a few minutes, but one of the things that we're exploring now, and again, this is all within the view of how do we connect and people across using these technologies, is that we probably all have been, in the past few years, in some ways disappointed with the state of social computing, or social media in particular, from anything from like misinformation to, potential addiction problems that people have to social media. And so one of the things that we wanted to explore in this new area of research is how to make these connections, how to connect people in ways that are kind of less heavy, more intimate, and perhaps more authentic. We all know, like, sometimes on social platforms, people tend to present the kind of artificial version of themselves, and that may create all sorts of different issues, or even lack of engagement in these platforms. And so I'll go quickly here just to show one of the things that we've been doing. So kind of part of the approach that we're taking for kind of reimagining social computing is to take advantage of new platforms as a new space to kind of redesign things from the ground up. And so new computing platforms like wearables is one of those, where we are thinking of, like, if we were to design tools that enable us to connect over distance in a more authentic way, what will devices like this allow us to do? And maybe like things like biosignals that are available here may allow us to do things that are different and maybe more intimate and more close. So I'll show you a video of a system that we've been exploring that kind of
Staying connected has never been easier. You can capture what you see, share what you think, and make your voice heard. But we don't often get to share from the heart. Introducing Animal. Animal uses biosignals from your smartwatch to generate an animal, an ephemeral avatar representing your current heart rate. Your animal will change throughout the day based on your heart rate. You can pair Animal with one special person. It's like having them on your wrist. Animal gives us a whole new way to stay connected. With a simple tap on your watch, your animal will jump out and visit your friend. When they receive it, they'll be able to see it come to life. Then Animal will jump back to your watch. You can use Animal to have an authentic and light touch connection with that one special person without having to take out your phone.
So we've been experimenting with the system. It's still very early. We have a paper that came out at UBCom last month. But basically, the idea here is like how to design this kind of more lightweight experiences. In this case, we're almost thinking of it more like a mood ring meets friendship bracelet, where really the goal is not necessarily to be like accurate or scientific, but it's more about thinking of this device beyond like self-quantification and tracking physical activity, and more of a playful way of connecting with that one special person beyond the like chatter that we see in all these feeds and inboxes and stuff like that. And so that's kind of still early, but we continue to explore this space. And the reason I mention it is because if you are interested in this area of using wearables for social connection, we are a place that you can do that kind of work. The other part that we are exploring as well is how to enable these connections not just online but in the physical world. And so we've been obviously inspired by things that are creative. Snap is a very it's a company focused on kind of creative expression. And so things like Lego bricks is one inspiration that even from the times of Scratch I found really inspirational. And so one of the things that we're experimenting with is the idea of using again, new platforms provide you new opportunities to explore things in new ways. And in this case will be the idea of how do you enable people in the same room to create, connect, and collaborate to build new things, to build kind of AR sculptures with something as simple as a mobile phone without having to have something expensive. And I'll show you a quick summary video. Oops, oh, this is not available. Here is an example of the kinds of things that people were doing. I don't know if you can see there. Yeah, unfortunately, the video is not playing. But the idea here is that you can take out your phone, and right there you see you can place blocks in the physical space, and then other people can add blocks to that as well. And so you can collaboratively leave sculptures, like in this room, for example. You come back tomorrow, and maybe somebody added something or removed something. And the idea really is that you can do these things across time. Or you can do it in the same time at the same place, which we found that people found it more enjoyable when it was at the same time in the same place, like the 2 individuals or 3 individuals being together. There was more fun. But obviously, if you wanted to be more like productive in terms of like creating more complex stuff, being able to do it whenever you wanted was easier. So we continue to explore this space in a variety of ways, trying to use AR as a form of a creative platform for connection and collaboration. So I wanted to close with giving shout outs to a lot of my collaborators, students and interns and other people who have worked with us across many of these projects. And just wanted to close also with if you are interested in any of these type of spaces, both AR that is collaborative and expressive and kind of social wearables, we're hiring both interns and full-time people as well. So with that, opening to questions. Thank you.
I think it's really cool that you published a data set on longitudinal 5-year stuff. Were there any follow-up work on that? Like, did other people take that data set and like find interesting?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of uptick from people who are studying computer science education, and they're trying to, for example, I recently read a paper of a team in Europe that built a system that analyzes programs in Scratch to detect like the paths which people are learning different, like how people arrive to Scratch and then learn different things, different computational thinking concepts by kind of predicting where you're going, essentially. Then I also seen people more like studying collaboration. Like there's a lot of people who study like collaboration on Wikipedia or systems like that, and they use this data set to study that as well. So yeah, it's a lot of. I mean, it's not like hundreds of papers, but there's maybe like dozens of papers that have used this data set. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen adults use Scratch? And do they differ in terms of like how they use it, and like, is it useful for adults as they are learning something languages?
Yeah. So the question is whether adults are using Scratch. Yes, we've seen that. Both, I think some introduction to computer science classes in college are using Scratch in like the first lecture or so on. But also we see a lot of parents who want to sit with their kids and they don't know programming either, but they want to learn together. And so that's another place. When I was working on Scratch, we also had a lot of companies who were interested in automation in general, and they wanted to make automation easier for people. And so I remember we talked to an IoT company that wanted to, allow people to program their like Nest-like devices and using a blocks-based programming language. So I think we've seen the blocks-based paradigm pop up in a variety of settings. So that's another place where adults have been engaged in that.
An independent language, so I can say like, oh, I programmed in Scratch. Is that something that you imagine that is?
Yes, I mean that's what I think it is. I mean, I think it's as powerful as many other programming languages out there. I mean, obviously it has limitations, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are some of the main takeaways that you have from the project, the news project?
The news project?
Yeah, like the local news project.
I guess as I mentioned, one of the things that we saw is that um, I saw a lot of promise in this type of work. I do see a limitations in terms of like scale, and as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I really try to focus on things that can be deployed and be used for real in real world settings, and that's always been the intent with all the projects we worked on. Doesn't always work, and that was one example where I think we try as hard as we could. I think the confluence of both the organization that you're at any given point and the system itself, may not work all the time. And so I think that's one of the limitations that we saw. In terms of like what else we learn, I think we work on a number of projects interested in news in general. And I think in some ways that was before all this like fake news dilemma that we're dealing with right now. And I think in light of that, I feel like this type of work is even more challenging. I remember at some point playing with the idea of like, oh, what if we were to like organize a gathering, like an impromptu gathering? And I think Michael, one of his students, did like these impromptu gatherings in real world. And then I saw this article about how like Russia did something like that, where like they brought like pro-Hillary and pro-Trump people in one place. They paid them, and they didn't realize that they were going to be in puppets. And so I don't know. I think in general, like I became a lot more maybe concerned about the execution of these type of things in the real world deployment. So I will say that's the main takeaway from me. Like I probably wouldn't want to do something as large. I still think there is a lot of room for exploration. And especially in places like Mexico, where I didn't even try to do anything because I felt like it was too dangerous. I feel like it's still not there yet. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Aspect of remixing and the Scratch community very interesting. And one was wondering if there were any specific design elements or design choices that promoted that behavior, or was it something about the task of creating games being inherently something remixable that makes that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that there are certain aspects of the language that makes it easier. Sometimes make it harder, but for example, there is the idea of a sprite. So like a cat can be a sprite and can have code associated with it. So if you like a project, but you just like the way, say, the cat moves, you can download that project and take just that piece and put it in your project. And so that makes it a lot more modular. Obviously, it's not as modular as, say, like, I don't know, JavaScript or something that you can build libraries and stuff like that. But we saw a lot of kids trying to build like library-like things. And some people posting projects that the whole point was just to say, oh, here is a bird flying, and you can control it with the keyboard, and it's just that, just for you to use it. And so that's one aspect is on the system itself, on the like language itself. And the other piece is on the social technologies that we built. We use language, basically we use like words that imply sharing a lot. So, first of all, every project was downloadable. You couldn't disable the download of your project. Now Scratch is fully on the web. So the community became such a central part of the experience that the language and the community is one single thing. And so that's now even easier. So like you go to every project and it's almost like a Wikipedia article where you can see the insight very, very quickly. And so that has made it even easier to remix. So I think I will say both the social and the technical pieces of the system have made it really easy to remix. That said, remixing itself was one of the main sources of pain in the community because moderation around like people complaining about somebody else copying their work and so on became a really big part of it. And so we had to have like an army of undergrads and other people like helping us with moderation, because there were things that are really easy to eliminate that are inappropriate, but there are like these tensions between two people who are like, well, who is right, and like, are they being mean to each other, especially kids. And so I think remixing was both a source of tension, and one of the reasons we studied so much around remixing was because we were trying to figure out how to solve that tension. And so yeah, that's a lot of things to explore there as well.